Howdy, everybody. We're ready to look at one of my very favorite topics in Google Sheets, creating pivot tables. Now, why pivot tables? If I were to try to take this data set and say that my boss came to me and said, I need to know how many tickets were sold at each of the destinations and then at each of the offices, how would you go about doing that? Well, you could sort, you could filter, you could add some sum functions, but it would really be a pain in the neck. The great news about a pivot table is it allows you to take a really thick, long data set like this one and quickly sort and filter it and also analyze it and calculate it with just a few clicks. Now, a few setup things. Again, pivot tables work best with that list format we mentioned at the very beginning of the course. So I've got column headers at the top and no entire blank rows. This data is only about 200 rows down, so it's not very big. But again, pivot tables can be used to analyze really large data sets. With that in mind, let's make a pivot table. I'm going to click anywhere inside the data, and then I'm going to go up to the Insert drop-down menu and come down to Pivot Table. It's right below Chart. Now, the first step is to pick the range that I'll be pivoting. It's already selected my range because I don't have any entire blank rows, but this button on the right would allow me to drag over the correct range if I needed to. Also, I always suggest the best practice of placing new pivot tables on a new sheet. That way you don't accidentally overwrite any of your existing data. We're ready to go. Let's click on the Create button. Once we click on Create, you'll see that you get a new blank sheet. Again, my original data is still back on sheet 1, and my new pivot table is called Pivot Table 1 or 2, depending on how many you've built. Now, we need to take from our column headers and create our pivot table. A pivot table is not about all your data, it's about focusing on specific pieces of data. So I'm going to start by taking the office field and dropping it in the rows area. I'm going to bring it under here and click on Add. Another way to do this is to actually click on the part of your pivot table by clicking on the Add button and then selecting the field you'd like included. Again, with values, I suggest using value fields. So I'm going to pick my totals field, and you'll see it's now doing a sum based on office. Now, I'd also like to see where this is intersected by the destination that was sold. So I'm going to take destination and drop it under columns. Now, you'll see a lot of blanks when I do this. This is important. Sometimes when you first start using pivot tables, people see these blanks and think, ooh, something's wrong. But it isn't. This is telling me an important piece of information when something didn't happen. Now, additionally, I can also filter my entire pivot table by taking a filter down or a field down to this filters area. We'll see that the filter will be available to me right here. When I click on it, I can actually perform a filter, and it will filter my entire pivot table in place. When I'm done, I can turn it off just by coming back, clearing it, saying select all, and it turns it off. Now, to edit my pivot table is also really easy. Let's say instead of the total field, I'd like to see the number of tickets sold. I can actually remove the total field by clicking on this X, and I can bring down a different field under my values area. Now I've seen the number of tickets that were sold at each office for each destination. I could also actually remove the destination, and we'll see that my pivot table will totally adjust. Now, have any of these changes impacted the data on sheet 1? Let's check it out. I'm going back to my original sheet. Nothing has happened. The beauty of a pivot table is that you can analyze specific columns of data in your pivot table, but your source data never adjusts. One important thing to remember about pivot tables is that you have to make sure that your source data on sheet 1 is refreshed with your pivot table. But the great news about Google Sheets is that they automatically refresh with each other. So try out a pivot table of your own inside the practice file. It's called Customer Pivot. You'll see how amazing and quick these are to analyze your data.